The last thing I'd like to talk about today is some concerns that people have about vaccination. You're probably familiar with the fact that in recent years, there has been the development of what is called the anti-vaxxer movement. There has been a growth of organized dissent, I guess, against the use of vaccines in public health. And this has been very concerning on many fronts, but particularly on the public health front, because vaccines save lives, and we don't want people to reject the use of vaccines because it will prevent us from achieving herd immunity against some of the most problematic infectious diseases that we fight against. When you listen to anti-vaxxer information, there are certain concerns that people bring up again and again as a reason that they don't want to get vaccinated or they don't want their children vaccinated. So I want to talk about some of those concerns and why they are misguided. The first and probably the most common reason that people give for not wanting to get a vaccine is that the vaccine can cause the disease that it is intended to prevent. Now, I hear this reason most often when I talk to people about the flu vaccine. People will tell me that they know someone who got a flu vaccine and who caught the flu from the vaccine. So we will talk about that and why that is not true. The second reason that people will give is that the vaccine contains too many antigens. The truth is, when we vaccinate children, infants and children, against the most common pathogens that we vaccinate against, we give the vaccines in combination with each other. And of course, that schedule that we use is based upon when infants and children are most likely to encounter those pathogens. You may have heard, for example, of the MMR vaccine that we give to infants and children. MMR stands for measles, mumps, rubella. We combine 3 vaccines together into one shot so that we can get that child vaccinated against those 3 diseases at the same time. Some people look at that and say, that's too much. That's too many antigens to be injecting into my child's body all at the same time. So we'll talk about that. Another reason that people fear vaccination is that they have heard that vaccines can cause autism, which is not true. We'll talk about that one as well. There are some people who have heard that vaccines can cause other diseases, can cause diseases and permanent severe injuries, for example. We'll talk about that as well. And the last category I call various other bizarre theories, a couple of other things that you will read in anti-vaxxer literature. But let's start with the idea that vaccines can actually cause the disease that they are intended to prevent. Again, this is not true. Modern vaccines cannot cause the infectious disease that they are intended to prevent. They either contain a destroyed version of the pathogen, or an attenuated or modified live or live attenuated, however you want to phrase it, version of the pathogen. And that version is no longer capable of causing infection. Many of the mild, common vaccine reactions actually mimic the infectious disease. And that's why people sometimes feel like the vaccine gave them the disease. You hear this a lot again in conjunction with the influenza vaccine. People will say, well, I got the vaccine, and a couple days later I felt terrible. I had a fever, and my muscles hurt, and I was very fatigued. So they assume that the vaccine gave them influenza, when in reality what they're experiencing is the immune reaction to the vaccine. The other thing that sometimes happens is people will get a vaccine, and within a week or two of getting the influenza vaccine will get the flu. And so it makes sense that they blame it on the vaccine. In reality, if you come down with the flu within a week or two of getting vaccinated, it's not from the vaccine. It's from the fact that you must have been exposed to the flu around the same time you got the vaccine. Remember, the development of antibodies takes time. It takes at least 2 weeks to have an antibody response to a vaccine. Also, conveniently, I guess, it takes about 2 days to 2 weeks to develop flu after you get exposed to it. So if a person were to get exposed to influenza one day and then receive a vaccine around that same time, it's possible for them to become sick with influenza before the vaccine creates enough antibodies to protect them. It's all about the timing of exposure and the timing of the vaccine. It doesn't mean that the vaccine caused the influenza. That's why in public health, it's recommended that people get their influenza vaccine before influenza is very prevalent in the community, so that they'll be able to develop the antibody response that they need before they get exposed to influenza in the winter months. Now let's talk about this mistaken belief that childhood vaccines particularly contain way too many antigens. The belief is that somehow combining vaccinations into a single shot is overwhelming the immune system of these children, and that is bad for their health. Combination vaccines are absolutely in use. I mentioned MMR. There's also one called Tdap, which is a combination of a tetanus vaccine and diphtheria and pertussis and so on. These are materials, these are shots, vaccines, that protect against multiple organisms. And again, the reason they're combined like this is because we need to get these children protected against the things they are most likely to contract in those childhood years. We need to get them vaccinated before they get exposed to these pathogens. Here's the thing that people don't understand. The human immune system is capable of responding to multiple antigens at a time. It's capable of responding, in fact, to hundreds of antigens every single day. We are constantly exposed to antigens, particularly infants and children, because they are living in a way where they're putting things in their mouths and they're crawling around on the floor and they are introducing antigenic material into their bodies all day long, every single day. And again, studies have shown that it's hundreds and hundreds of antigens that are coming into their little bodies every single day. So combining, 3 or 4 or 6 antigens into a vaccine and giving that vaccine to a child is not going to overwhelm their immune system. One of the reasons that people give for not wanting to vaccinate, and in fact, what some people point to as the birth of the anti-vaxxer movement, is this question about a possible connection between vaccination and the development of autism. If you're not familiar with the history of this, there was a study that came out many years ago now by a scientist named Dr. Wakefield, and that study concluded that there was a connection between childhood vaccination and the development of autism. Now, because this study got so much attention, many scientists went back and looked at the study to see if it was a strong scientific study. And in fact, it wasn't. Dr. Wakefield used children from his own medical practice for his study, which is not a good idea. That is not good science. He didn't use any kind of randomization in picking his study participants. Instead, he picked a small number of children from his own medical practice. He only used 12 children in this study of his. He then went on to look at whether or not the children had been vaccinated and whether or not they had developed autism in the oncoming months. What Dr. Wakefield was trying to do, in other words, was correlate, to use a mathematical term, correlate vaccination and the development of autism, and he claimed in his paper that he had done that. Now, if you've taken a statistics course, you know that correlation does not mean causation. In other words, just because two things occur together does not mean that one thing caused the other thing. So even if it was shown that vaccination occurs at the same time that autism develops, that doesn't mean that vaccination causes autism. In fact, it turned out that Dr. Wakefield hadn't even shown that in his study, because it turned out he had taken some, let's say, unusual, untraditional routes with his statistics. I don't want to say that he lied. I would rather say he made mistakes in the statistical analysis that he did. So his paper was not only discredited, but it was withdrawn from the literature. It was recalled. It was pulled out of the journal once it was discovered that it was not scientifically sound. Unfortunately, that paper had already caused a lot of discussion and had already led some parents to believe that vaccination causes autism. Many, many studies have come out since the release of Dr. Wakefield's flawed study. Hundreds of experiments have been conducted, and papers have been published across many scientific journals that have all concluded that there is no link between childhood vaccines and the development of autism. There is nothing about vaccines that causes autism. It has been discredited. Unfortunately, as I said, some people had already made up their minds that vaccines cause autism, and that's one of the reasons that they will give for not wanting to vaccinate their children. The truth is that children are vaccinated during their first few years of life, and the time when children are receiving vaccines routinely also happens to be the time that children develop signs of autism. So you can see where people would connect the two things. But just because two things happen at the same time doesn't mean one thing causes the other. There have been various stories in the news media that vaccines can cause other diseases that create permanent and quite severe injuries. There have been hoaxes that have been perpetrated over the internet where people have claimed that they were vaccinated and then they developed some bizarre neurologic disease, for example. These things have been discredited story by story by story. Yes, most vaccine associated adverse reactions are mild and short-lived. The fever and the swelling and the pain that come from vaccinations doesn't last more than a day or two. Severe long-term injury from vaccination is very rare. And remember that even the more severe symptoms like seizures are coming about as a result of the immune reaction. The fever that can be triggered by the cytokines that are produced during an immune reaction. The fever can lead to seizures, not the vaccine, the fever. Individuals that have certain immune problems, however, are going to sometimes have these rare and severe reactions. Individuals who have allergies, for example, to vaccine components, or individuals who have an issue with their immune system where they are not just going to produce fever, but they're going to produce very high fever. Those people are the people that sometimes have these very rare but very severe reactions, again, which can include death. I'm going to finish up today with this last category of other bizarre theories. These are the things that make me shake my head every day when I read about them, but I thought I would share them. When the HPV vaccine was approved for use, and the scientific community determined that the HPV vaccine should be administered to women and men when they were young, there were some reactions to that news in the public. So if you're not familiar, this is a vaccine that we administer to children. We administer the vaccine with the idea that we want to get them vaccinated against HPV before they become sexually active. And so it becomes part of their medical care when they are prepubescent. 13 years old, 14 years old is the time that this vaccine is typically administered. So when this hit the news, when the vaccine became available and it became evident that 13 and 14-year-old kids were going to be vaccinated against this sexually transmitted disease, certain people were very upset by that. And there was this outcry that HPV vaccination would make children promiscuous. And certain states actually worked hard to prevent physicians from administering this vaccine to children. It's a crazy notion that trying to administer a vaccine is going to somehow make a child promiscuous. But the ideal was that, this is a sexually transmitted disease. And so if we protect a child against a sexually transmitted disease, we are giving them permission to have sex. Now, I don't follow that logic myself, but a lot of people in certain parts of the country really wanted to stop this vaccination program, even though the science showed that 90% of cervical cancer in women was due to HPV infection. Even though what this vaccination program was about was preventing cervical cancer in women, people were still against it. The truth is that HPV is the most common cancer-causing virus on our planet, and that the vaccine has been shown to be very effective at preventing human papillomavirus infections. And so in time, we should see that cervical cancer numbers should be plummeting as we protect girls and boys against human papillomavirus. There is no evidence in the social science literature that suggests that vaccinating young people against HPV makes them more sexually active. There is no evidence of that. And perhaps more importantly, there has been no reports of severe adverse reactions to this vaccine. And that shows you that we are getting better and better at producing vaccines so that we don't see as many of these rare and severe reactions, these 1 in a million reactions. The hope is that as we get better and better at identifying the antigens that pathogens carry, we will be able to better and better pare down the material that goes into a vaccine so that it is less and less and less likely that we will see these 1 in a million severe reactions. The truth is that vaccination programs have been the single most effective public health program that has ever been developed. The single most effective public health program. We have, in fact, eradicated one of the most significant pathogens that ever existed on this planet. We have eradicated smallpox from planet Earth using the smallpox vaccine. We have to remember that some people cannot be vaccinated. So we have to strive for herd immunity through vaccination in order to protect our most vulnerable citizens. The risks of vaccines are low. Serious, life-threatening, life-altering reactions are 1 in a million. And that is a much lower risk than the risk of contracting one of these infectious diseases and having, again, life-threatening, life-altering results. Right now, there are some states in this country that allow parents to send their children to public school without being vaccinated and without providing anything other than a personal exemption claim. And there's a movement now that says that we ought to go back to a program where parents who elect not to vaccinate their children should not be allowed to send their children to public school because they are putting, again, the most vulnerable children at risk. We ought to think about implementing a national program, which we have had in the past, by the way, that says that unless there's a medical reason that your child can't be vaccinated, you need to get your child vaccinated if you want them to come to public school. Hopefully, people will begin to get educated again about how important vaccines are. We will debunk some of these fears that parents have, and we will get back to overall appreciation for vaccines and an understanding that they help prevent some of the most significant deadly infectious diseases. Just a final word about a very newsworthy vaccine that's in development right now, and that's the vaccine that is being developed against SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. I'm sure you have all heard that there are multiple vaccine candidates that are being developed right now, with the hopes that sometime next year we will have a vaccine or multiple vaccines, frankly, that can be distributed worldwide and can help us get this pandemic under control. There are clinical trials that are underway, again, for multiple vaccine candidates in multiple countries around the globe. The two things that vaccine developers have to exhibit for a candidate vaccine are that, number one, that the vaccine is safe, and number two, that the vaccine is efficacious, that the vaccine does what we need it to do, which is stimulate an immune response and the production of antibodies against an infectious pathogen, against SARS-CoV-2. You've probably heard that there are a couple of vaccines that are very promising, that have come through the first part of clinical trials with shining colors. They have been shown so far to be safe and to elicit an immune response, but those are phase 1 clinical trials, and we have to get through phase 3 clinical trials. In other words, we have to get to the place where we can give these candidate vaccines to tens of thousands of people and show that they are safe and efficacious. Right now, the phase 1 clinical trials have involved somewhere between 30 and 50 people. And again, they've shown very promising results, but we need to be able to show that we have those results in large groups of people before we're able to approve those vaccines for use. The estimated time right now to the availability, the widespread availability of a vaccine against this virus is about a year. So even though some politicians are saying that we will have a vaccine before the end of 2020, in all likelihood, we will have a vaccine in the spring of 2021. And that's if these trials continue to go so well. When these vaccines become available, it's important to know that they will be rolled out. In other words, we will have vaccine available for the people who are most at risk first, healthcare workers. And then the next group of people to be vaccinated will be, say, people who are also quite vulnerable to infection. And then another group of people will be brought in and vaccinated. The vaccine will be rolled out, in other words, in a controlled manner until the whole population who wants to be vaccinated is vaccinated. And right now, the hope is that by the end of 2021, we will have most people vaccinated against this pandemic virus. Only time will tell. Keep watching the news for the development of these vaccine candidates.